Mr. President, may I now request you to deliver your address?
Be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the UN Charter. It's a historic document. It embodies the enduring hope for a sustained, peaceful and secure global community of a world of good governance, rule of law and respect for human rights. High hopes, grand ambitions. I am honored and humbled that the General Assembly has entrusted me with chairing its 70th session. I believe that the coming year will be one of the most defining years in the history of the UN, and I hope that it will, the next session, the 70th session, also be a year of positive importance. It is imperative that the 70th anniversary of the United Nations not only be a memorial of the past, but a confirmation and invigoration of the universal values we, the peoples, agreed upon in the Charter. The anniversary of the UN must serve as the new commitment to action, and indeed this is the theme of my presidency, the UN at 70, a new commitment to action. My priorities as president will include focus on the three fundamental pillars of the UN, of course, the one, implementation of outcomes in development, climate and financing. Two, strengthening the UN's role and performance in peace and security. And three, human rights, including gender and rule of law. India is a significant contributor to the work of the UN in all three pillars and brings a respected and valued voice to the table of the United Nations. At the coming summit in September in New York, at the opening of the 70th session of the General Assembly, the world will come together with, as far as I know now, 165 heads of states and government to adopt the 17th Universal Sustainable Development Goals as part of the 2030 Agenda. We have heard the criticism that there are so many goals and so many achievements mentioned that it's difficult to summarize what it's all about. But I think that this will indeed be a historic achievement and a momentous milestone for the United Nations, because what is going to be approved by the 165 heads of states and government is a genuine transformative document, epic in its analysis and revolutionary in its ambitions. It is the proof to the world that the United Nations, after 70 years of existence, is still relevant and still able to break new ground. It shows that the UN is truly an organization that promotes international cooperation and multilateralism and forces us to set aside national, personal or special interests and to think and act globally. India has, together with all the member states of the United Nations, been determined to reach an agreement, and the 2030 Agenda is a indeed ambitious and transformative outcome of this determination. Not only member states have been involved in this process. The whole process of formulating the 2030 Agenda has been much more of a global bottom-up process than we have ever seen before in the workings of the United Nations. And in my view, this has been a most encouraging hallmark of multi-stakeholder engagement, involving millions of engaged world citizens through national and international NGOs, as well as, very important, including an increasingly progressive business community of the world. With the Millennium Development Goals we agreed on 15 years ago, we were successful in cutting extreme poverty on this globe down to half. But with the SDGs, we emphasize that we cannot eradicate extreme poverty with the model for global economic growth over the past 15 or the past 70 years, because it's both socially and environmentally unsustainable. That's a far-reaching conclusion. Therefore, in the 2030 agenda, we insist on a much fairer distribution of global resources between countries and within countries. There is no socially sustainable development in a world where the 92 most wealthy dollar billionaires have accumulated more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion people, half of human race. If we are to fulfill the basic promise of no one left behind, if all men and women are to get access to global goods like energy, water, food, education, and health care, we must share more equally. And with the 2030 agenda, the international community recognizes that eradication of poverty, the fight against inequalities, environmental catastrophes, and climate change are closely interconnected and parts of the same struggle. Since the day when I was born 70 years ago in Italy, the number of people on this planet has tripled. The 3 times as many people today are on average, but very unequal, consuming more of the global capital than each individual did 70 years ago. Therefore, we have an urgent need to make fundamental changes in our production pattern, our consumption patterns, our energy systems, etc., to avoid what I think President Obama rightly pointed out last month, the risk of an unstoppable degradation of human living conditions. I just came out of this very interesting conversation with your Prime Minister, where he also underlined that if we should be successful in the sustainable development, we had to change our way of life. And I repeated what I have said in this discussion many times at home and abroad. You know for sure that when billions of people in emerging economies reach out for the same lifestyle as we have had in the Western world for some time, you know 2 things for sure. They cannot get it and we cannot keep it. We only have one planet. And we are reaching the limitations, the capacities of that planet, even if we are extremely innovative in the coming decades. If climate change and destruction of environment continues, we will never be able politically to mobilize the necessary resources for development as outlined in the Agenda 2030. In order to address these challenges, innovative ideas will have to be made reality. Facilitation of green technologies, development of science and data and capacity building will be crucial. But we also have to mobilize and invest within the next 15 years trillions of dollars in a more sustainable infrastructure of this world. We had the conference in Addis Ababa last month, where we actually outlined that there are three main sources for providing these huge amounts of investment capital. First, the poorest country, the least developed countries, can only do it when rich countries finally live up to their long-standing commitment of minimum 0.7% of GDP in development assistance. Secondly, more money, much more money, has to come from national governments also in developing countries. And that must be enabled through a much better organization and international cooperation in order to get rich companies and rich people to pay taxes where they earn their money. We have to fight in an international coordination, tax evasion and corruption, and the evil interconnection between tax evasion and corruption. But even if we are successful at the first and the second of these priorities, we must realize that most investment will have to come from private business, from pension funds, from capital institutions of every kind, regional investment banks, development banks, and so on. And therefore, it's so essential for the success of the Sustainable Development Goals that governments, national governments, supported by international organizations, create the framework through regulations and taxation, etc., that makes it evident that in future generations there is not much money to earn without sustainable behavior. It's obvious if you see it long perspective, but it's very, very important to create the framework in each and every nation that makes it obvious now. And I think that has very much to do with what the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals are about. So, hereby I said also that agreeing on a uniquely ambitious text in the 2030 agenda is only the beginning. The hardest work remains ahead of us. And what we will try to do in the short window of my presidency in the United Nations General Assembly will be to focus as much as possible with the support of high-ranking personalities from the political, the business, and the NGO world, to focus on all aspects of the rapid implementation of this agenda. Governments must understand the urgency to act before it's too late to secure living conditions for our children and our grandchildren. And the first and the big test of this willing to act is an ambitious outcome of the COP21 in Paris in December, because it's in the field of climate change that the most urgent decision has to be taken. I'm sure that as one of the biggest and fastest growing economies in this world, India's level of ambition in this regard will also be crucial, as well as, of course, the United States, China, the European Union. I count on India's and your support in this, because time is running out for all of us. More generally, one could say that we are living in paradoxical and transformational times, times of defining challenges, but also times of major opportunities. I wish to leave you today with these opportunities imprinted in your mind and call for the action. I mean, never before have such a large share of humanity enjoyed so good a life, with higher living standards as well as better health and education compared with previous generations. But as I said, inequalities are bigger than ever. And never before have we faced this great risk of fundamentally disrupting the basic living conditions. Never before has there been stronger attention on the demand for gender equality, but still there is a huge gap to close. A larger part, paradoxically, of humanity lives in peace and has done so for a longer period than any before in human history. But the follies of war and self-destruction have increased in many parts of the world, the Middle East and Africa, even in Europe, creating greater refugee flows than we have seen any time since the end of World War II. Truly, this is something that will be high on the agenda when we mark the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. I believe, as I have already underlined, that this year we can make a strong start on the implementation of the 2030 agenda, and that we can do a good work in making member states accountable to living up to what they promised this September in New York. The implementation and the way of implementation will be the responsibility and under the ownership by each and every member state. I hope that we can create a strong platform for this and a strong focus on this. I believe we can contribute also to the global understanding of interconnectivity of goals, not only in all aspects of social and environmental sustainability, but also in the strong linkage between development, peace and security, and respect for human rights. The implementation of this agenda across each of the three pillars of development, peace and security, and human rights will be the central focus of the 70th session of the General Assembly and my presidency there. I will offer strong support to new ideas of how to improve the peacekeeping activities of the UN, the peace operations, the peacekeeping architecture, and the efforts to empower women also in situations of conflict. I hope that we will, through the coming year, be able to have a more coherent support for reconciliation and peace building, also including conflicts we have failed to deal with until now. And I hope that the next Secretary General will be able, at the very beginning of hers or his service, to push for an reorganization of the whole organization so that it will reflect the more holistic view we have on development, sustainability, peace and security, and human rights. I will also support work on new initiatives to better deal with terrorism and radicalization and the asymmetrical wars that are going on now, which collectively challenge us to prevent and counter this violent extremism. The representatives of the Indian government I have met have underlined the need of finally ending the negotiations over the Convention Against Terrorism. And I think that also here we have some ground for optimism, because during the Security Council resolutions over recent years, the definition of terrorism, which has been the sticking point in this long-standing discussion, has been more and more clearly defined in the wording of different resolutions. I hope that we finally can get some progress in the general agenda on disarmament, both nuclear and conventional. And I will support member states in contributing more to making human rights a living reality, both the elementary right of food security, basic health services, clean water and education and jobs that can support families, but also freedom of expression and rule of law. Finally, many have pointed out their interest in seeing progress in the reform agenda in the United Nations. This is both a question of reorganizing the bureaucracy, as I said, but it's also a question of making progress in what we call the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly, and of course, which has, for good reasons, high attention in India, the reform of the Security Council. I'm here now. I know the limitations of the mandate. I know it's a short window. I think it's a very, very interesting challenge we have in front of us in the coming year. I have, as long as I remember, personally been very engaged in the efforts to create a strong framework for the international community. Actually, when I was 15, I worked into the offices of the United Nations organization in Copenhagen to collect information about this. And I remember that also then I sincerely hoped that the framework in which rationality and humanity could prevail was here, that we had the possibility of making disarmament agreements possible, that we could have a chance much better with the United Nations than without, to finally bring major powers to cooperate for a better future for the whole human race. And that we could assist peoples, as the United Nations actually did in those decades, in attaining self-government and independence, and that we could, without racial prejudice, protect the rights of minorities, vulnerable and marginalized groups, including women, children, displaced people, people with disabilities, and indigenous people. Of course, we haven't by far not reached what we set out to do, but still we have the framework that if we didn't have it, we had to invent it now. And I hope that these old ambitions and hopes remain as relevant as ever, and that 2015 is the time to make a new commitment to action for the sake of generations to come. That is the signal we should send out as we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the world's most representative, deliberative, multilateral body we have. Thank you very much for listening to me.